right, up next we're going to be making our half rectangle triangles. Now, the half rectangle triangle can be a little bit intimidating, but I'm going to show you how they are really doable. You just have two spots where you need to make sure that you are thinking about the shapes and the alignment of them. And other than that, they are really pretty simple. So I'm going to show you exactly what you need to do. So for our quilt, we have kind of two sets of two columns, so a total of 4 narrow columns of half rectangle triangles. We're going to be constructing them in pairs though. So we'll do one column that has 2 side-by-side half rectangle triangles and then the other column. So total, we make 2 columns using what we're calling our fabric F. And then we make 1 column each of fabric G and H. And we're going to do a little bit orientation differently depending on which fabric we are using. The background fabric will be the same in all of our columns. Now, the first thing that we're going to do is mark some diagonal lines on our background fabrics. Depending on which direction we want the background fabric and the diagonal line between the background fabric and the foreground to be, we need to be drawing our lines on half of our background fabrics in opposite directions. So I'm going to flip all of my background fabric rectangles over. On half of them, I'm going to draw a line from my top left corner to my bottom right corner. You can mark those lines however you like. So I'll mark that way on half of them. On my other stack, I'm going to mark from top right corner to bottom left corner. Now, for now, I'm going to take those top left corner to bottom right corner rectangles, and I'm going to just set those aside. I'm going to be using those ones when I construct the second half of my fabric F, as well as my fabric H half rectangle triangle. So I'm going to take those and just set them aside with my background. Now, for my first half of my fabric F, as well as my fabric G, your first thought might be to just set your rectangles right sides together and stitch across the line. The problem is, and you can see, if I were to fold along this line, if I had stitched there, I don't wind up with a rectangle, right? I wind up with this kind of weird polygon shape. So in order to wind up with our half rectangle triangles to actually turn into a rectangle, we're going to take our background and we just rotate it 90 degrees. So again, I've got my foreground fabric just sitting straight. I've got my background fabric with my line drawn from my top right corner down to my bottom left-hand corner. I just rotate it so that my points match up in this corner and my points match up down here. I recommend using a couple pins just to make sure that those stay in the correct position. Then I'm going to do the same thing for my fabric G. So for half of my fabric F rectangles, as well as all of my fabric G rectangles, this is going to be the orientation that I will pin. Okay, once you have that pinned that way, then we'll have that whole stack pinned. Now, for the other half of our fabric F, as well as fabric H, those are going to be oriented. If you look at the sample of the finished quilt, we've got a fabric F and G with kind of all of the points facing up, and then fabric F and H have all the points facing down. So we need these half rectangle triangles to be oriented the opposite direction. So in this case, I'm going to take my foreground fabric, either F or H. I'm going to take my background fabric where I had drawn on the wrong side from the top left-hand corner down to the bottom right-hand corner. Now again, we don't place it right on top of each other. We rotate it so that the opposite corners match up. So in this case, you want it oriented and looking like this. And again, I'm just going to take a couple of pins and make sure that those get pinned in those correct directions. okay? So you're going to follow that same marking and pinning for all of these pieces. So I'm going to have half of my fabric F, all of my fabric G will be oriented this direction. And then the other half of my fabric G, as well as my fabric H, will be looking like this. So you can see the difference between the two. Okay? Now, regardless of which way I've got them oriented, I'm then going to take all of those to my machine. And I'm going to stitch 1/4 inch on either side of my drawn line. So I've got my line drawn from corner to corner. I'll stitch 1/4 inch to the right, as well as 1/4 inch to the left of those drawn lines. I'll do that for all of these pieces, regardless of which direction and regardless of which fabrics I'm using. So let's go take care of those stitched lines, and then we'll look at the next steps. All right, so I've got each of my sections back from stitching. So you can see on all of them, I've got a line sewn 1/4 inch on either side of that drawn line. And that is true regardless of which direction I drew my lines. And so now for all of them, again, regardless of their orientation, my next step is going to be to just cut right along that drawn line. So I'm going to take my ruler and line up the edge of my ruler right along that drawn line. And I'm going to then cut each of my pieces in half so that I wind up with 2 half rectangle triangles out of all of them. Now you actually, you make 5 sets of each, so you wind up with 10 of each type of half rectangle triangle. You will actually only use 9 of them, so you will have 1 extra for each kind. So you can see now these open up, and this is the magic of half rectangle triangles. They open up to form a triangle, or I'm sorry, a rectangle. So you are going to now take all of these to your iron, and you're going to press all of them towards the darker fabric. So in this case, I'm going to be pressing away from my background on all of them. Okay, so we've got all of our half rectangle triangles pressed, and we are ready to trim them. Now, the first tricky piece of half rectangle triangles is just remembering that you need to rotate them to line up your corners so that you wind up with an actual rectangle when you open up your seams. The second tricky part can be trimming them, but I'm going to show you 2 different methods that will make this really simple for you. So I'm going to show you 2 different methods. I will show you one orientation for each method. So I'll show you each orientation with each method. So you can see I've got all of these blocks are oriented the same way. All of these ones are oriented the opposite way. So these ones have my seam coming from top left to bottom right. These ones are the opposite, okay? Now, what's interesting is that we'll actually wind up flip-flopping these when we go to make our final blocks. But for now, we're going to be keeping them this way because all of these will be trimmed the same. All of these will be trimmed the same, okay? So I'm going to start by taking one of my fabric G blocks, and so this is oriented this way, and I'm going to show you how to use block lock rulers for trimming your half rectangle triangles. Block Lock sells 2 different sized sets of half rectangle triangle rulers, and so each set actually comes with 2 rulers that are the same size, and you can see that is because they come with one that has your seam oriented either direction, okay? So when we trim our half rectangle triangles, the reason that this can be tricky, if you think about a 1/4 inch seam allowance around the outside of a block, if we were to just trim straight a 1/4 inch, in fact, I can show you a 1/4 inch from this point right here would not land directly on, so this would be a 1/4 inch from the top and a 1/4 inch from my left-hand side. It's not going to land on my seam line, because our seams are not at a 45-degree angle. And half square triangles, we want our points to be exactly in the corners of our trimmed block because that seam is at a 45-degree angle. So a 1/2 inch in and a 1/2 inch down will, or I'm sorry, a 1/4 inch in and a 1/4 inch down will land exactly on the seam. With rectangles, because this is not a 45-degree angle, we need to do a little bit of finagling. So in this case, you can see, if you look carefully at the block lock ruler, you can see that it's a little bit offset. So that this line is going to be the seam. This is my full seam allowance here. You can see that in each corner, it's a little bit offset from exactly where the corner of the ruler is. So the block lock rulers, again, just like our flying geese, they are going to set right on top of your block. And you can see, let me get it out of that reflection. You can see how it doesn't sit straight, right? It doesn't sit straight with your edges of your fabric. So the rectangles that we created are oversized from the ones that we need to trim. For half of your fabric F, as well as your fabric G, you're going to be using your A ruler. So I'm going to trim my 2 sides. I'll take the whole thing, I'll rotate it, and when I rotate it, I just want to lock it back onto my seam allowance, and again, just make sure that I am lined up with the cut edges that I already cut. And then I'm going to trim my other 2 sides. Okay, so when I take away the ruler, again, you'll notice I am not exactly at the corner. The seam does not come right up to the corner, but I'm going to show you using my other ruler here. So with this ruler, you can see if I take now and place that along the edges, the 1/4 inch line that is a 1/4 inch in and a 1/4 inch down, which is right where the corner of my finished block will be, now lays perfectly on top of my seam. So then I'll repeat that same process for my blocks that are oriented in the other direction. This time I'm going to use my B ruler. Again, I'm going to lock that in place on my block, and I'm just going to make sure you'll notice on your rulers, there's a section that says seam allowance this side. So that means that, okay, this is my seam allowance here because I pressed towards my darker fabric. So I'm going to set this right on top there and go ahead and trim all 4 sides of this block. So I'll trim my first 2, I'll rotate it, I'll make sure that that gets lined back up, and I'll trim my next 2 sides. And again, my block turns out so that my seam is not landing perfectly in the corner, but if I take and measure, the seam is exactly a 1/4 inch in and a 1/4 inch down. It's a little bit hard to see with that reflection there. Let me see. There we go. Okay, so that is using the block lock rulers. Now, the block lock rulers are an investment. So if that is not something that you already have or that you're able to purchase, we can use any standard ruler as well. So I'm going to show you how to make those same cuts using a standard ruler. You want your ruler to be at least at the size of your finished block. So in this case, I'm sorry, not your finished block, but your trimmed block. So our trimmed blocks are going to be 4.5 by 8.5. And so I'm going to take my ruler. This ruler is 12.5 inches by 6.5. So it is longer and wider than the size that I want to end up with for trimming. I'm going to take my ruler and I'm going to go ahead and tape off the size that I want. So in this case, I want my blocks to be 8.5 inches long. So I have some washi tape here. You can use blue painter's tape or masking tape, but I find that it is easier if we go ahead and tape off the size that we want our blocks to be, just so that we are not making any mistakes by eyeballing where those lines are. So I'm going to tape off, that's 8.5 inches. And then I'm going to do the same thing for my 4.5 inches wide. So again, I'm going to take my tape and just mark off 4.5 inches. Okay, so that will be the size of my trimmed block, okay? Now, when we are trimming, remember, we don't want to trim exactly straight with the block as we have the block constructed. We want our seams to land at the 1/4 inch seam allowances. So the next thing I'm going to do is take a dry erase pen and I'm going to just mark a dot at a 1/4 inch in and a 1/4 inch down. And then same thing at my opposite corner. I'm going to mark a 1/4 inch in and a 1/4 inch up. So I've got those two lines drawn and I'm going to make sure that my seams line up with those two dots. So next I'm going to take my block. I've got my block oriented this direction. I want to make sure that both of my dots fall directly on top of those drawn lines. And then I want to make sure that my fabric fills my entire section that I taped off, okay? Once I have my dots lined up with my seam, then I'm going to trim my two sides. Okay, then I will rotate my fabric. Okay, I'm going to line up my two already trimmed lines with the edges of my tape, and I'm just going to double check that my dots will line up with my seam in both corners. And I'm ready to trim my last two lines. And then I've got my 4.5 by 8.5 inch rectangle ready to be sewn together. We can do the same thing with our rectangles that are oriented the other direction. We are just going to move where we place our marks with our dry erase marker. So in this case, I'm going to come to my top right side and I'm going to measure in a 1/4 inch over and a 1/4 inch down, and I'm going to draw a dot there. Same thing, bottom left corner, 1/4 inch over, 1/4 inch up. So same thing, I'm going to lay my ruler on top of my rectangle here. I just want to make sure that my fabric fills my full ruler and that my seam lines up with those dots. And I'll go ahead and trim my first two. And then I'll rotate. Again, I'm going to line up with the edges of my tape. And I'm going to double check. Oops. I want to make sure that I've got my seams lining up with my dots that I drew, and I'll trim my other two sides. Okay, once you've trimmed all of your half rectangle triangles down, this is what you should wind up with. You should wind up with, again, remember we wound up with 10, but we'll only use 9 of each. So you should wind up with 9 of your fabric F oriented this direction, 9 this way, and then a set of fabric G and a set of fabric H. And so you are going to then pair them together to create triangles that look like this, and then triangles that look like this. So again, I'll just pin and then, or don't pin, and then sew a 1/4 inch here, press those seams. Same thing with these ones, you'll sew a 1/4 inch. So right sides together, sew a 1/4 inch, press those seams. You'll wind up with a set of blocks that look like each of these that you will then stack on top of each other to form your final columns.